Some say you should forgive the dying, that a deathbed somehow erases decades of wounds inflicted, that blood is thicker than the poison it can carry. I believed none of that. When the hospital called, a strange Vermont area code lighting up my phone at 3:47 a.m., I almost didn't answer. Perhaps some primal instinct knew that Elizabeth Sullivan was reaching for me one last time. My mother, whom I hadn't spoken to in 7 years, was summoning me from beyond the wall I'd carefully constructed. Miss Sullivan listed you as her healthcare proxy, the doctor said, his voice clinically detached. Her condition is critical. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Decisions need to be made. The irony was sickening. The woman who once locked me in a closet for spilling juice on her manuscript was now handing me the key to her mortality. The woman who had systematically dismantled my sense of self for 29 years now placed her life in my hands. I wondered if other people's mothers did this, weaponized their own deaths. 3 days later, standing in her hospital room, watching her unconscious form, I realized her final manipulation might be her greatest masterpiece. A catch, 22 wrapped in maternal obligation, step in and relive every trauma, or walk away and drown in guilt for the rest of my life. She had orchestrated her final checkmate. What she couldn't have anticipated was my third option. 7 years earlier, on an unseasonably warm November afternoon, I had methodically removed my mother from my life. It wasn't an impulsive decision. Like any significant amputation, it required planning, precision, and the acceptance that there would be phantom pain for years to come. I'd spent months in therapy, dissecting our relationship under the careful guidance of Dr. Winters. Together, we cataloged the evidence, the childhood diary entries, the voice messages I'd saved, the inexplicable tremor in my hands whenever my phone displayed her name. We tracked the way my body physically responded to her presence, elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, the instinctive curling inward of my shoulders as if bracing for impact. Remember, Fiona, Dr. Winters had said during our final session before the separation, cutting contact isn't about punishing her. It's about protecting yourself. Elizabeth Sullivan, celebrated author of psychological thrillers with a devoted readership and six-figure advances, was masterful at creating intricate fictional worlds where victims became unwitting accomplices in their own destruction. What her readers didn't know was that she had been perfecting these narratives on me since my birth. My earliest memory, age 4, standing in our kitchen while she read aloud the note my preschool teacher had sent home. Fiona is a delight in class. Her imagination and vocabulary are remarkable. Most mothers would have been proud. Mine had crouched down, her face inches from mine, and whispered, "They don't see what I see. If they knew the real you, they'd send you back." For years, I believed there was something fundamentally wrong with me that only she could perceive. This was her gift, making me doubt the reality that existed outside her orbit. She could transform my achievements into evidence of my deficiencies. My friendships became suspect. My enthusiasms became character flaws. The separation began with practical matters. I changed my phone number, moved from Boston to Chicago without a forwarding address, deleted social media accounts and created new ones under a variation of my name, asked mutual acquaintances to respect my privacy. The usual witness protection program of the emotionally abused. What surprised me most was the immediate physical relief, like removing a pebble from my shoe that I'd been walking on for so long I'd forgotten it was there. Colors seemed brighter. Food had more flavor. The constant low-grade fever of anxiety that had been my baseline temperature began to cool. I found myself smiling at strangers, entering rooms without first assessing emotional weather patterns, speaking without mentally editing every sentence for potential ammunition it might provide. Over the following years, I built a life in the vacuum she had left. I finished my degree in architectural restoration, found work with a firm specializing in repurposing abandoned industrial spaces into community hubs. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I spent my days transforming neglected structures, reinforcing unstable foundations, finding beauty in what others had discarded. I made friends who knew nothing of Elizabeth Sullivan or her daughter. I dated occasionally, though intimacy remained a complicated terrain. I adopted a three-legged shelter cat named Vonnegut who greeted me each evening with unqualified affection. The nightmares decreased from weekly to monthly to occasionally. The reflexive flinch when someone raised their voice gradually subsided. I was healing in the slow, non-linear way that healing happens when the wound has been open for decades. Then came the phone call from Vermont, a state where my mother had never lived, at least not while I was in her life. Miss Sullivan was admitted 3 weeks ago, explained Dr. Harrison, the physician who had awakened me. The cancer is aggressive. She's been refusing most interventions. Yesterday, she lost consciousness. We need guidance on how to proceed. There must be some mistake, I said. We haven't spoken in years. She was quite explicit, he replied. She updated her advance directive 6 months ago. You're named as her healthcare proxy, with full decision-making authority. My first thought wasn't about her suffering or her fear of dying alone. It was suspicion. This felt like a plot point in one of her novels, the estranged daughter summoned to the deathbed, forced to confront unresolved trauma under the most emotionally manipulative circumstances possible. I'm sorry, but I can't help you, I said, and hung up. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, it was a woman identifying herself as the hospital social worker. I understand this must be a shock, she said, her voice gentle but firm. But legally, unless you formally decline the role and we can locate an alternative proxy, these decisions will default to you. I sat on the edge of my bed, watching the first gray light of dawn filter through my blinds, creating prison bar shadows across my bedroom floor. What happens if I decline? I asked. The hospital's ethics committee would step in. But I should warn you, they typically err on the side of continuing interventions, which may not align with what your mother would want. There it was. The perfect trap. Walk away, and potentially condemn her to exactly the kind of prolonged, medicalized death she would hate. Step in, and be pulled back into her gravitational field, exactly when I'd finally achieved escape velocity. I'll need to think about it, I said. After ending the call, I sat motionless for nearly an hour. Vonnegut pressed against my leg, his rumbling purr the only sound in the room. Eventually, I reached for my laptop and searched for flights to Burlington. Not because I felt love or obligation, but because I needed to see for myself what fresh hell she had engineered. Green Mountains Regional Hospital occupied a modern campus outside Burlington. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked forests beginning their autumn transformation, a picturesque setting for the ugliness I was walking into. The intensive care unit was hushed, the only sounds the muted beeping of monitors and the whispered conversations of staff. Dr. Harrison met me at the nurse's station, a tall man with premature gray hair and the practiced compassion of someone who regularly navigates other people's worst days. She's been remarkably stoic throughout her treatment, he said as we walked toward her room. Refused pain management until absolutely necessary. Kept working on her laptop until about 2 weeks ago. Working? Of course. My mother would see terminal cancer as an inconvenient deadline, not unlike a publisher's. I wondered what manuscript she was finishing, what fictional world she was perfecting while her actual one disintegrated. Has she had visitors? I asked. A few. Her editor came twice. A research assistant brings her mail weekly. Otherwise, she's been fairly isolated. We paused outside room 418. Through the glass partition, I could see her for the first time in 7 years. Elizabeth Sullivan had always been a commanding presence, tall, with angular features and penetrating gray eyes that could make you feel simultaneously seen and found wanting. The woman in the hospital bed retained only the faintest outline of that person. Her cheekbones protruded sharply beneath translucent skin. Her once auburn hair, which she had colored religiously at the first sign of gray, was now white and sparse. The hands that had typed millions of words lay motionless on the institutional blanket. Cancer had accomplished what I never could. It had made her small. The prognosis? I asked, not taking my eyes off her. Days, possibly hours. The cancer has metastasized extensively. Her liver is failing. We're managing symptoms, but without more aggressive interventions. What decisions need to be made? Currently, she's receiving minimal support, fluids, low-dose pain management. If her condition deteriorates, we need to know whether to escalate care. Intubation, resuscitation, feeding tube, these are all possibilities. I nodded, still watching her through the glass. I'd like to review her medical records and advance directive before making any decisions. Of course, I should mention, she has been in and out of lucidity. If she regains consciousness while you're here. I understand. But I didn't. I didn't understand any of this. Why she had moved to Vermont, why she had named me her proxy, why after 7 years of silence she would create this final, impossible scenario. The social worker, Miranda Living, provided me with a folder containing my mother's paperwork. We sat in a small consultation room where she explained the legal parameters of my role. As healthcare proxy, you're obligated to make decisions based on what you believe your mother would want, not necessarily what you would choose for yourself, she explained. That's the problem, I replied. I don't know what she would want. People change in 7 years. Miranda's expression remained neutral, but I detected a flicker of judgment. She didn't know our history. From her perspective, I was simply a daughter who had abandoned her mother. Her advance directive provides some guidance, she said, pointing to a document. She specifically declined ventilator support and CPR, but was less clear about other interventions. I scanned the paperwork, looking for clues. The advance directive had been completed 6 months ago, around the time of her diagnosis, I presumed. My name and contact information were listed with a precision that chilled me. She'd been keeping tabs on me all along. At the bottom of the second page, in the section for additional instructions, she had written in her distinctive, slanted handwriting, "My daughter understands me better than anyone. I trust her to know what I would want." The statement was so blatantly manipulative that I nearly laughed. In her books, my mother often wrote characters who weaponized their own vulnerability, villains disguised as victims. She was employing the same narrative technique now, from her deathbed. After reviewing the documents, I went to her room. A nurse was checking her vital signs and adjusting her for. "She's been peaceful today," the nurse said kindly. "The pain is managed. Sometimes hearing is the last sense to go. You might want to speak to her, even if she seems unresponsive." When we were alone, I sat in the chair beside her bed. Up close, the ravages of her disease were even more apparent. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. Occasionally, her eyelids would flutter, but they didn't open. "Hello, Elizabeth," I said, deliberately using her first name. "It's Fiona." No response, not even a change in her breathing pattern. "I received your message. Naming me as your proxy. Very effective." Still nothing. I need to understand why. After everything, why pull me back in now? The monitors continued their steady beeping. Outside, rain began to tap against the window. I sat there for nearly an hour, watching her breathe, feeling neither the catharsis nor the renewed anger I had anticipated. Eventually, a different doctor came in to check on her, Dr. Winters, no relation to my former therapist. She was younger than Dr. Harrison, with a direct manner I appreciated. "We've just received the latest blood work," she said. "Her kidney values are declining rapidly. We should discuss comfort measures." What exactly does that mean? Essentially, transitioning from interventions meant to prolong life to those focused solely on ensuring comfort. Increased pain medication, possibly sedation if there's any sign of distress. And how long would she? Hard to say. Without artificial hydration, typically a few days at most. I nodded slowly. And that's what she specified in her directive? Comfort measures only. Dr. Winters hesitated. She wasn't entirely clear. She declined certain interventions but left room for interpretation on others. That's why your role is crucial. There it was again, the burden of interpretation. My mother, who had built her career on psychological ambiguity, was maintaining it to the end. I spent the rest of the day alternating between her room and the hospital cafeteria, where I picked at a sandwich and researched pancreatic cancer on my phone. I learned that by the time symptoms appear, the disease is usually advanced. That pain can be excruciating. That even with treatment, the 5-year survival rate is dismal. Had she known she was sick when she named me her proxy? Had she anticipated exactly this scenario, her unconscious, me forced to become reacquainted with her through the clinical details of her failing body? Around 8 that evening, as I was preparing to leave for my hotel, her eyes suddenly opened. "Water," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I froze, then reached for the cup with its bent straw. I held it to her lips, and she took a small sip. Her eyes found mine, those gray eyes, now clouded but still unmistakably hers. "Fiona," she said. "You came." "Yes. I knew you would." Of course she did. She had engineered it precisely for that outcome. "Why did you name me your proxy?" I asked, not bothering with preliminaries. "After 7 years of no contact?" She closed her eyes briefly, and I thought she might drift back to unconsciousness. But then she spoke again, each word requiring visible effort. "Because you're the only one who knows the truth." "What truth?" "About me. What I'm capable of." Her statement hung in the air between us. Was this a confession? An acknowledgement of the damage she had inflicted? Or was it another manipulation? A breadcrumb designed to keep me engaged in her narrative? "That doesn't answer my question," I said. "Why force this responsibility on me now?" She attempted what might have been a smile, but on her wasted face, it appeared more like a grimace. "Not everything is about you, Fiona." The familiar sting of her dismissal. How quickly she could make me feel childish, self-absorbed. For a moment, I was 29 again, sitting across from her at the restaurant where I had planned to tell her I was cutting contact, listening as she systematically dismantled my reasons before I could even express them. This isn't about me. Making me your healthcare proxy without my knowledge or consent. She took another sip of water. Read my new manuscript. Top drawer. She gestured weakly toward the small bedside table. I hesitated, then opened the drawer. Inside was a USB drive labeled The Proxy in her handwriting. What is this? My last book. Not for publication. For you. Before I could question her further, her eyes fluttered closed, and her breathing settled back into the shallow rhythm of before. The brief moment of consciousness had passed. I pocketed the USB drive and left the hospital, unsettled and angry. Even now, she was turning our relationship into one of her psychological thrillers, complete with mysterious clues and ambiguous intentions. At my hotel, I plugged the drive into my laptop. It contained a single Word document titled The Proxy Final Draft. The file was password protected. I tried several combinations, her birthday, mine, the titles of her books. Nothing worked. Finally, out of frustration, I typed, "I know what you did," and the document opened. The manuscript wasn't a novel as I had expected. It was a memoir. The memoir began with my birth. Not the sanitized version she had always presented, the brilliant author whose creativity only flourished after becoming a mother, but a raw account of postpartum depression that bordered on psychosis. She described intrusive thoughts of harm, dissociative episodes where she couldn't recognize her own child, the crushing weight of expectations she could never meet. As I read through the night, a different Elizabeth Sullivan emerged from the pages, still deeply flawed, still responsible for her actions, but also broken in ways I hadn't understood. She wrote about her own mother, my grandmother who had died before I was born, with a clarity that was shocking. The patterns of emotional abuse, the withholding of affection, the impossible standards, all of it echoed through our generations like a dark inheritance. I swore I would never become her, she wrote. Instead, I became something perhaps worse, someone who knew the damage being inflicted and continued anyway, watching myself destroy my child as if from a distance, unable to stop the cycle. The memoir wasn't an apology. It offered no explicit remorse for specific incidents I remembered vividly. The time she'd locked me out of the house in winter because I'd interrupted her writing, the public humiliations, the systematic undermining of every relationship I attempted to build. Instead, it was a clinical documentation of her own psychological disintegration, with me as collateral damage. The final chapters detailed her diagnosis, the first symptoms she had ignored, the denial, then the moment of recognition, not just of her mortality, but of the legacy she was leaving. Cancer offers clarity, she wrote. Stripped of future, you see the past without filter. What I saw was a daughter who had every reason to wish me dead, who would now be forced to decide the manner of my dying. The perfect punishment for us both, she for her abandonment, me for deserving it. I closed the laptop at dawn, my eyes burning from tears and sleeplessness. The memoir had answered my question. She had named me her proxy as both punishment and acknowledgement. A final power play embedded with a twisted form of respect. She believed I was the only one who had seen her clearly and survived. When I returned to the hospital that morning, Dr. Harrison intercepted me in the hallway. Her condition deteriorated overnight, he said. Multiple organs are now failing. We need to discuss end-of-life care immediately. In her room, a palliative care specialist named Dr. Chun waited with charts and compassionate eyes. At this stage, she explained, we're looking at two primary options. We can continue current interventions, fluids, antibiotics for secondary infections, minimal nutritional support, which might extend her life by days or possibly weeks, but likely with increasing discomfort. Or we can transition to comfort care only, which means we focus exclusively on pain management and symptom relief, allowing natural death to occur. Would she be in pain? I asked. We would ensure she wasn't. That's our priority in palliative care. I thought about the woman described in the memoir, controlled by fears, perpetuating cycles of harm she herself had experienced, aware of her failures but unable to break free of them. In your experience, I asked Dr. Chun, do patients in her condition have moments of consciousness near the end? It varies. Some patients rally briefly, what we sometimes call terminal lucidity. Others slip away without regaining consciousness. I nodded, thinking, if we transitioned to comfort care, would there still be time? I mean, if she woke up, Would there be opportunity for conversation? Dr. Chin's expression softened with understanding. Possibly. We can balance pain management to allow for moments of clarity while ensuring comfort. Then that's what I want. Comfort care, but with the possibility of consciousness if it comes. The doctors left to prepare the orders, and I sat beside my mother's bed. Her breathing had become more labored overnight. Occasionally, a small sound escaped her, not quite a moan, but something primal and troubling. I thought about the memoir, about the woman who had written it in the knowledge that I would read it only after she could no longer defend or explain herself. Was it courage or cowardice to reveal yourself only when you no longer had to face the consequences of that revelation? Around noon, the nurses came to remove most of the monitoring equipment and adjust her medication. They positioned her more comfortably and dimmed the harsh overhead lights, leaving only a soft lamp glowing. "Talk to her," one nurse suggested quietly before leaving. Hearing often remains. When we were alone, I moved my chair closer to the bed and, after a moment's hesitation, took her hand. It was cool and papery, nothing like the hands I remembered. Hands that had gestured emphatically during her readings, that had typed relentlessly through the night, that had sometimes struck with precision when words failed to wound deeply enough. "I read your manuscript," I said. "I understand why you chose me as your proxy. It wasn't just punishment. It was acknowledgement." Her breathing remained unchanged. "I want you to know something. I didn't leave because I hated you. I left because it was the only way I could exist separately from you. You created worlds with words, but you never allowed me to create myself." The afternoon stretched into evening. Hospital shifts changed. New nurses introduced themselves in hushed tones. Outside, the mountains disappeared into darkness. I dozed occasionally in the chair, waking whenever her breathing pattern changed. Around midnight, her eyes opened. "Fiona," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here. You read it?" "Yes." And I hesitated. What did she want from me? Forgiveness? Understanding? Some absolution I wasn't prepared to give? "I think you wrote it for yourself, not for me," I said finally. A slight movement of her head might have been a nod. "Perhaps. Why name me your proxy?" The truth this time. She was silent for so long I thought she might have drifted back to unconsciousness. When she spoke again, her voice was surprisingly clear. "Control. At first. Then trust. Trust." I couldn't keep the disbelief from my voice. "You were the only one who ever stood up to me, who saw clearly." Her breathing had become more labored. "I trust you to do what's right, not what's easy." "And what's right, Elizabeth? More time at any cost? Or letting go?" Her eyes found mine with sudden lucidity. "You know me better than anyone. What do you think?" It was the same manipulation she had always employed, forcing me to make the hard choices, then judging my decisions. But this time, I recognized the pattern without being ensnared by it. "I think you're afraid," I said quietly. "Not of dying, but of not being remembered. That's why you wrote the memoir. Not as explanation or apology, but as immortality." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Perceptive," she whispered. "Always were." "I need to know one thing," I said, leaning closer. "Did you ever love me? Not as an extension of yourself, not as a character in your story. Just me." Her eyes closed briefly, and when they opened again, they were filled with tears, the first I had ever seen her shed. "Yes," she said. "Imperfectly. Insufficiently. But yes." A tear slipped down her hollow cheek. I reached up and wiped it away, an intimacy that would have been unthinkable in our former life. "Then let me do this one last thing for you," I said. "Not as your proxy, but as your daughter. Let me help you finish your story with dignity." She held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. I pressed the call button, and when the nurse arrived, I requested the palliative care team. An hour later, after consultation with Dr. Chin, my mother's medication was adjusted to ensure complete comfort as her body shut down. I stayed beside her, watching as her breathing grew shallower. The night passed in a strange suspension of time, minutes stretching into hours or collapsing into seconds. I spoke occasionally, not about forgiveness or the past, but about small, ordinary things. The changing leaves outside her window, the architecture project I was working on, the three-legged cat waiting in my apartment. Just before dawn, her breathing changed, becoming irregular, with long pauses between breaths. The death rattle they had warned me about began. a sound I will never forget. "It's okay," I told her, though I don't know if she could hear me. "You can let go now." At 6:17 a.m., Elizabeth Sullivan took her last breath. I was holding her hand when she died. The morning after my mother's death, I met with the hospital's bereavement counselor, who provided information about funeral homes and grief resources. I made arrangements for cremation, something that hadn't been specified in her paperwork but seemed appropriate given her practical nature. In her wallet was a business card for an attorney in Burlington. When I called his office, I learned that she had updated her will 6 months earlier, concurrent with her advance directive. The lawyer, Mr. Grayson, was a soft-spoken man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He expressed condolences with what seemed like genuine sadness. "I only knew your mother briefly," he said, "but she spoke of you often." I doubted this was true. More likely, he was offering the standard comfort one provides to bereaved family members. "She made some very specific provisions," he continued, sliding a document across his desk. "In addition to her financial assets, which are substantial, there's the matter of her literary estate." I scanned the first page of the will. The financial details were straightforward: investments, royalties, real estate in Vermont, and a small villa in Greece I hadn't known about. All of it now mine. "And the literary estate?" I asked. "She's named you as her literary executor," Mr. Grayson explained. "You'll have complete control over her published works, any adaptations, and, most significantly, her unpublished manuscripts." I looked up sharply. "Including the memoir?" He nodded. "She was quite explicit about that. There's a letter that accompanies the will." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in her familiar handwriting. I slipped it into my bag, not ready to read it in front of a stranger. "There's one other matter," he added. "A key to a safety deposit box at Vermont Federal Bank." She indicated it contains items of significant personal value. After leaving the attorney's office, I walked through Burlington's downtown, trying to process the morning's revelations. My mother had left me not just her money, but complete control over her legacy, the one thing she had valued above all else. At the bank, a manager escorted me to the vault and left me alone with the safety deposit box. Inside were several items: a vintage brooch I recognized as having belonged to my grandmother, a small, worn copy of Jane Eyre that had been my mother's childhood favorite, a collection of my school essays and artwork she had apparently kept, and a thumb drive labeled Complete Works, unedited. But it was the final item that caught my breath: a stack of unsent letters addressed to me, one for each year we had been estranged. 7 envelopes, never mailed. I returned to my hotel room and placed the letters on the desk beside my laptop. For hours, I couldn't bring myself to open them or the letter from the will. Instead, I called work and extended my leave of absence. I contacted a realtor about my mother's Vermont property. I answered emails from her editor and agent, who had been notified of her death. Only after darkness fell did I finally open the letter from the will. "Fiona," it began without preamble. "If you're reading this, you made the difficult choice I expected you would. You didn't run this time. You stayed until the end, despite having every reason not to. That tells me more about who you are than anything else could. I've left you everything, not as compensation. What could compensate for the childhood I gave you? But as acknowledgement. You survived me. More than survived, you broke free. You're the only protagonist who ever escaped one of my stories. The memoir is yours to do with as you choose. Publish it, burn it, use it to understand, or use it to forget. Your decision. The only true gift I can give you is this choice, the autonomy I never allowed you in life." The letters in the safety deposit box are a different matter. I wrote them without the expectation of response, possibly without the hope of forgiveness. They are as honest as I'm capable of being, which may not be honest enough. I named you my healthcare proxy not as my final act of control, though I recognize the cruelty in the choice, but because, in the end, you were the only person who ever truly saw me. Not the author, not the manipulator, but the damaged woman beneath it all. I trusted you to make the right decision, whatever that might be. I have no right to ask anything more of you, but I will anyway. Find a better story to tell yourself than the one I gave you. I was wrong about many things, but most of all about you. You were never the villain in my story. You were the hero in your own. Elizabeth. I set the letter aside, my vision blurred with tears I couldn't categorize: grief, anger, relief, all tangled together in a complex knot that might take years to unravel. The 7 unopened letters remained on the desk, a chronicle of years I had spent building a life without her. I didn't open them that night, or the next. Some stories need to be approached cautiously, their revelations absorbed slowly over time. Instead, I plugged in the thumb drive containing her complete works. There, among files of published novels and short stories, was a folder labeled The Proxy Drafts. I opened it to find not just the final version I had read, but earlier iterations, the evolution of her attempt to understand herself, and by extension, me. In the earliest draft, dated shortly after her diagnosis, her tone was defensive, almost accusatory. By the final version, something had shifted, not quite remorse, but recognition. The journey between versions told a story of its own. Before leaving Vermont, I visited her house, a modest Cape Cod on 2 acres outside Burlington. It was sparsely furnished but meticulously organized. Her office overlooked the mountains, positioning her desk to catch the morning light. On the walls were framed covers of her books, reviews from prestigious publications, photos of her at literary events. What struck me most was what wasn't there. No photos of me, no evidence of her life before becoming Elizabeth Sullivan, celebrated author. She had curated her environment as carefully as she had curated her public persona. In a closet, I found boxes of papers, research for her novels, correspondence with her editor, fan mail she had saved. And at the bottom of one box, unexpectedly, a photo album I remembered from childhood. Inside were pictures of us, awkward holiday poses, a beach vacation when I was 7, my high school graduation where she had stood stiffly beside me, both of us smiling for the camera while maintaining careful physical distance. The final photo was one I had never seen, me at perhaps 4 years old, asleep on her lap while she worked on a manuscript, one hand typing, the other resting protectively on my back. Someone else must have taken it, a rare moment captured when she didn't know she was being observed. I closed the album and returned it to the box. Before leaving, I stood in her office one last time, absorbing the space where she had created worlds and characters, where she had written the memoir that was perhaps her most honest work, and certainly her most painful. On the flight back to Chicago, I began reading the 7 letters, one for each year of our separation. They weren't apologetic in any conventional sense. They didn't ask for reconciliation or understanding. Instead, they chronicled her life without me, the book she was writing, the small Vermont community she had moved to after I left, her gradual withdrawal from the literary world she had once dominated. The early letters contained traces of the old manipulation, subtle digs, passive-aggressive observations. But as the years progressed, these fell away, replaced by something that resembled genuine reflection. In the final letter, dated just 2 months before her diagnosis, she wrote, "I started therapy last year. My therapist suggested writing to you as an exercise, though we both know these letters will never be sent. Yesterday, she asked what I would say if I could tell you just one thing. I've been thinking about it for 24 hours, and I believe the answer is this. Thank you for saving yourself from me. It was the bravest thing anyone in our family has ever done." Vonnegut greeted me with enthusiastic affection when I returned to my apartment. My neighbor who had been feeding him reported that he had seemed lonely but was otherwise fine. I spent that first evening back simply sitting on my couch, the cat purring on my lap, adjusting to the idea that Elizabeth Sullivan no longer existed in the world except in her books and in my memory. In the weeks that followed, I sorted through the practical aftermath of death, closing accounts, transferring assets, responding to condolence messages from people in the literary world who had no idea of our estrangement. Her editor called about a partially completed manuscript found on her computer, a new psychological thriller she had been working on until near the end. Did I want them to find another author to finish it? No, I said firmly. Let it remain incomplete. Some stories should be allowed to end where they naturally conclude. As for the memoir, I read it twice more, each time seeing new layers, understanding more about the woman who had both created and nearly destroyed me. I recognized patterns in her behavior that I had unconsciously replicated in my own relationships. I saw how her damage had shaped my responses to the world, my hypervigilance, my difficulty with trust, my tendency to anticipate betrayal. 3 months after her death, I made 2 decisions. First, I would not publish her memoir. Not because I wanted to protect her reputation, she had carefully crafted that during her lifetime, but because some revelations are meant for their intended audience alone. The memoir had been written for me, not for public consumption. Making it public would transform an intensely personal communication into a commodity, which felt like a betrayal of the fragile honesty it contained. Instead, I established a small literary foundation in her name, focused on supporting writers exploring intergenerational trauma and psychological recovery. The irony wasn't lost on me. using her money to help others articulate the very damage she had perpetuated. But perhaps that was the most fitting memorial, allowing her legacy to fund the breaking of cycles she couldn't break herself. Second, I began writing my own account. Not a counter-narrative or rebuttal to hers, but a parallel exploration. Two perspectives on a shared history that could never be fully reconciled. I wrote not for publication or vindication, but for integration. To make sense of being both victim and survivor, both damaged and healing, both her daughter and my own person. 6 months after Elizabeth's death, I returned to Vermont to finalize the sale of her house. The realtor had found a buyer, a retired professor of comparative literature who admired my mother's work. The synchronicity seemed appropriate somehow. While packing the last of her belongings, I discovered something I had missed during my first visit, a hidden panel in her office wall, behind which was a small safe. The combination wasn't difficult to deduce: my birth date. Inside was a manuscript I hadn't seen before, dated a month before her death. Unlike the memoir, this wasn't professionally formatted or edited. It was handwritten on yellow legal pads in her increasingly shaky script, the handwriting of someone whose body was failing but whose mind remained relentlessly active. The title page read, "Confessions of a Monster: What I Couldn't Say in Therapy." I sat on the floor of her empty office and began to read. What followed was unlike anything she had ever written: raw, unstructured, often incoherent. Pages of stream of consciousness that veered between self-flagellation and self-justification. Detailed accounts of incidents I had suppressed or forgotten. Explicit acknowledgement of manipulation so calculated it made me physically ill to read it. I told the therapist half-truths, she wrote. Painted myself as wounded, not wounding. Couldn't admit, even there, what I had done deliberately. The times I sabotaged her friendships because I was jealous. The boyfriends I undermined because they took her attention. The achievements I minimized because they threatened my sense of superiority. She documented moments I had attributed to her psychological issues, but which she now claimed were conscious choices. The time she had read my diary on my 16th birthday and then used its contents to humiliate me at dinner. The scholarship I received that she had nearly sabotaged by calling the committee with concerns about my emotional stability. The relationships she had poisoned with subtle insinuations. The sickness wasn't that I didn't love her, she wrote toward the end. The sickness was that I loved her and destroyed her anyway. What kind of monster does that make me? By the time I finished reading, night had fallen. I sat in the darkness of her office, the pages scattered around me like debris after an explosion. This wasn't the sanitized account of the memoir, where she had positioned herself as damaged but ultimately sympathetic. This was something else entirely, a confession without expectation of absolution. Had she intended me to find it? The hiding place suggested yes, the content suggested no. It felt like reading someone's most private self-laceration, never meant for other eyes. I gathered the pages carefully and took them outside to the fire pit on the back patio. Using kindling from the woodpile, I built a small fire and, one by one, fed the pages into the flames. Not to protect her, but to free us both. Some truths serve no purpose once spoken. They exist only to unburden the teller, not to heal the told. As I watched the last page curl and blacken, I felt no catharsis, no neat resolution. Just the quiet recognition that even this final revelation couldn't fully explain the complex knot of love, fear, talent, and damage that had been Elizabeth Sullivan. Back in Chicago, life continued its forward momentum. I was promoted at work, leading a major project to convert an abandoned factory into a community art space. I started dating someone cautiously, with more therapy sessions scheduled to help navigate the inevitable landmines of intimacy that appeared. The royalty checks from my mother's books arrived quarterly, money I couldn't bring myself to use for personal expenses but instead diverted to the foundation. Her books continued to sell well, particularly after her death received coverage in literary circles. The narrative that emerged in obituaries and tributes was exactly what she would have crafted herself, the brilliant, reclusive author who had revolutionized psychological thrillers, whose insight into human darkness was unparalleled. No one mentioned the daughter. I had become a footnote in her public story, if that. A year after her death, I received an email from someone named Thomas Whitaker. The name was vaguely familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. The subject line read, "Regarding your mother. You likely don't remember me," the email began. "We met once, briefly, at a publishing event in Boston about 10 years ago. I was your mother's research assistant for her novel, The Manipulation, and several subsequent books. I did recall him now, a quiet, serious young man who had hovered at my mother's elbow during a book launch, taking notes when she spoke to important people, fetching drinks, managing the details she considered beneath her. I've debated contacting you since hearing of her passing, the email continued. What finally prompted me to write was seeing the announcement of the foundation you've established. It seems you might understand some things I've struggled with for years. He explained that he had worked closely with my mother during a period when I was still in her life but increasingly distant, my college years and early 20s. He had witnessed her reaction to my gradual pulling away, had been privy to conversations about me that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Your mother used people, he wrote. I don't think that's a revelation to you. What you might not know is how many of us there were, research assistants, graduate students, aspiring writers she would mentor briefly before discarding. We were all replacements for you, I eventually realized. Substitutes she could control in ways she could no longer control you. He had left her employment after 3 years, disturbed by what he called her emotional vampirism. He'd gone on to become a therapist specializing in narcissistic abuse recovery. I'm not reaching out to demonize her, he assured me. God knows she was brilliant and could be extraordinarily generous when it suited her purposes. But I thought you should know you weren't alone in what you experienced. There were others of us, a small diaspora of Elizabeth Sullivan survivors. He ended by offering to connect me with some of these others, if I was interested. No pressure, he emphasized. Just an opportunity to share experiences with people who might understand in ways few could. I didn't respond immediately. The idea that there were others, people who had been drawn into her orbit and damaged by it, was both validating and disturbing. I had always conceptualized my experience as singular, unique to our mother-daughter relationship. The possibility that she had created a pattern of relationships based on the same dynamic suggested something more calculated than I had allowed myself to believe. After 2 weeks of consideration, I replied to Thomas, accepting his offer to connect with others. What followed was unexpected, not the communal victimhood I had feared, but something more nuanced. Over several months, I exchanged emails and eventually met with 5 people who had worked closely with my mother in various capacities. Their experiences echoed aspects of mine: the initial charm and mentorship, the gradual boundary violations, the subtle undermining, the punishments for asserting independence. But they also spoke of her genuine brilliance, her occasional startling kindness, her vulnerability in rare unguarded moments. Like me, they had spent years trying to reconcile these contradictions. Malcolm, a former graduate student who had been her research assistant for her true crime period, put it most succinctly: she taught me everything I know about narrative structure and human psychology. She also nearly destroyed my confidence as a writer. Both things are true. These conversations complicated my understanding of Elizabeth Sullivan in ways that felt necessary. She wasn't simply my toxic mother or the literary world's psychological genius. She was a woman who had created consistent patterns of harm across multiple relationships while also producing work of undeniable value. 2 years after her death, I made a final decision about her memoir. While I wouldn't publish it, I would include heavily edited excerpts in an academic paper I was writing on intergenerational trauma for a psychology journal. Not identified as hers, that would violate the privacy I had decided to maintain, but as anonymous case study material. The paper, when published, received significant attention in therapeutic circles. Several universities requested permission to use it in their clinical psychology programs. Without knowing it, Elizabeth Sullivan was continuing to illuminate the darkest corners of human behavior, this time in service of healing rather than entertainment. In my apartment, I created a small, private ritual. I took the photo album I had found in her house and the 7 unsent letters and placed them in a wooden box alongside the thumb drive containing her complete works. Not hidden away, but not prominently displayed either. Just present, like the complicated legacy she had left me, neither fully integrated nor fully rejected. Vonnegut watched from his perch on the bookshelf as I closed the box and returned it to its place on my shelf. He had grown comfortable in our home, his initial wariness replaced by a cautious trust. The shelter had warned me he might always be somewhat skittish given his history of neglect, but over time, he had learned that not all hands cause pain. Some scars remain even after healing occurs. The cat's missing leg, my heightened vigilance in relationships, the complicated grief that has no clear resolution. This is what I've come to understand. There is no single truth about Elizabeth Sullivan. She was both the monster of that hidden confession and the wounded woman of the memoir. Both the manipulative mother who used me as emotional collateral and the dying woman who trusted me with her final dignity. And I am both her creation and my own, shaped by her damage but not defined by it. The hospital called at 3:47 a.m., and everything changed. Or perhaps, more accurately, everything was finally called by its true name. She named me her healthcare proxy not just as a final act of control, but as a recognition that I was the only one who had ever truly seen her. The only one who could make the impossible choice with clear eyes. In the end, the woman who had spent her life crafting perfect psychological traps had created one last symmetry. I began my freedom by cutting her off. I completed it by letting her go. 5 years after my mother's death, I stand in the community arts center that was once an abandoned factory. The Elizabeth Sullivan Memorial Writing Room occupies the top floor, a light-filled space where emerging writers can work without the financial pressures that drive so many to abandon their craft. The irony isn't lost on me, using her name and money to create the kind of supportive environment she never provided. But perhaps that's the point, to transform what was toxic into something nourishing. The foundation now funds therapy for adult children of narcissistic parents, research into intergenerational trauma, and residencies for writers exploring these themes. We've just launched a scholarship program for students studying both creative writing and psychology, bridging the gap between art and healing that my mother never managed to cross. Thomas Whitaker serves on our board of advisors, along with several respected therapists and writers. The Elizabeth Sullivan survivors, as we sometimes call ourselves with dark humor, have formed an unlikely community. People connected by the experience of having been used by the same brilliant, damaged woman. My personal life has settled into something I never thought possible. I'm engaged to be married to someone who understands boundaries and respects mine. I've developed friendships that don't leave me exhausted or constantly checking for hidden agendas. I've learned to recognize the warning signs when old patterns begin to emerge in my behavior. The nightmares are rare now. The memoir sits untouched in the wooden box, no longer a text I need to revisit. The 7 letters have been read so many times their creases are wearing thin, but I find I turn to them less frequently. Sometimes, I still feel her presence when I'm writing. That critical inner voice assessing every word choice, every character motivation. But increasingly, I can acknowledge the voice without being governed by it. Last week, a package arrived from a rare book dealer in Boston. A first edition of Jane Eyre, similar to the one I found in her safety deposit box. Inside was a card from Malcolm. Thought you might want your own copy, not hers. Some inheritances are worth refusing. He was right, of course. The most important choice I've made wasn't becoming her healthcare proxy or literary executor. It wasn't deciding what to do with her memoir or establishing the foundation. It was recognizing that I could accept the complexity of our relationship without accepting the narrative she had created for me. That I could acknowledge her influence without surrendering to it. That I could hold the truth of who she was alongside the truth of who I am becoming. Elizabeth Sullivan named me her healthcare proxy as her final act of both control and trust. What she couldn't have known was that in forcing me to make that impossible choice, she gave me the opportunity to choose myself, not in opposition to her this time, but with a clarity that honored us both. In the end, perhaps that was the only gift she could give me, the chance to write my own ending to our story.